Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. I'd like to start by asking you a question, and that is, hello. And that is, who here works remotely from home at least some of the time? Yeah, it's a good sort of few of you. I'd say maybe sort of 20, 30% or something like that. Who here never works remotely, always in the office? Yeah, sort of a small handful of you, actually. I'm sort of interested in what the people who didn't answer do. Maybe you just go into the office and don't work. My second question for you, then, is working remote as good as working in the office? Who thinks it is at least as good as working in the office, working remote? Ooh, there's I see about 6 or 7 out of, I guess there's about 100 people here. So most people do not. Who thinks it's a lot worse than working in the office when they work from home? One person. So does that mean the rest of you just think it's a bit worse than working in the office? It's probably a fair assumption. So that's interesting, and hopefully by the end of this talk, we'll have a better understanding of why people have these different opinions towards remote working. And hopefully I'll convince you actually that the question shouldn't even matter, because I believe where you work physically, the location shouldn't actually matter, and you can work equally effectively working remotely or in the office. And the reason I know that is because, as William Gibson, the science fiction writer, wrote, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And it happens, as I'll explain, that I have actually come from the future, and I have seen remote work working well, and I'm here to share some of my findings with you. So this talk is all about living in the future, why remote work is good, why some companies struggle with it, how to do it well, and coping with the personal challenges that working remotely sometimes brings up. Bit of a spoiler alert, actually, it will turn out that this isn't a talk about remote working at all. It's actually a talk about flexible working and people being able to work in the manner that suits them the best. But first, a bit about me. My name is Alex Warren, and I am currently an engineering manager at a company called AlphaSights. We have offices in New York and London. Those are the two offices where engineers mostly work. We do have a full-time remote CTO, interestingly enough, but most of the developers in the office come into the office most of the time, working from home occasionally as required. We also have a distributed sort of remote team out in Brazil, but yeah, effectively it's a remote-friendly company. But mostly the sort of the default is that people come into the office to do their work. Before that, I worked for about 18 months at a company called Trainline. That was a similar kind of setup. It was remote friendly, but again, really the default was in the office. And I'll sort of explain a bit more kind of detail about what that looked like. But the future that I told you I came from was the 3.5 years I spent working for a company which I guess some of you may have heard of. Stack Overflow, I worked for between 2014 and 2017, and that's a very interesting company to have worked for. Stack Overflow works in a remote-first way, which I'll explain in a good amount of detail in this talk. So this was my office when I worked at Stack Overflow. That was everything, that was my entire world. I did all of my work from there, all of my meetings from there. That's my dog, Harry. He was not really very much help at all, to be honest. And the technologies that we used to facilitate that remote work were technologies that you're probably all familiar with. Trello for managing work and sort of seeing the status of particular things at any point. We used both Slack and also an earlier internal chat system that the company had developed, basically because Slack didn't exist when the company was founded. Google Docs was used for a lot of sort of planning, collaboration, and other things I'll tell you about in a bit. We used Google Hangouts and also Zoom for video chats. And we used GitHub like every other developer in the world. So basically, it was nothing special, and yet remote work worked very well indeed. And so for those 3 years, I got very used to a particular working style, and I sort of assumed that, oh yeah, this is the way that development is done now, and yeah, people understand how remote work works, and they can sort of see the benefits, and people generally do it really well. But what I found in early 2018, when I left Stack Overflow and started a different job, I was back in an office again for most of the time. And what I found returning to an office environment kind of surprised me, actually. I was quite surprised by some of the primitive technologies that I saw people were still using in 2018. Things like actual physical whiteboards, which I hadn't seen for a number of years. The place was absolutely covered in these sticky yellow and colourful post-it notes. And most archaic and disturbing of all, this thing called Skype for Business. What is this? It really felt like I had come from the future. It was very, very confusing. And what I discovered in that company was that physical presence seemed to be required to actually get things done in that company, but things didn't actually seem to work all that well at all. There were a number of problems that I saw. There seemed to be lots of meetings all the time, sometimes a whole day just filled up with meetings. And yet things didn't really seem to get written down, so it was kind of hard to keep track of what was going on. There was a lot of information that only existed in people's heads, things like how the software worked and what the current status of the various projects that were going on was. And the office was noisy. It was very hard to concentrate at times because people were chattering away. And you would have thought with all of this communication going on that people would have a good idea of what was happening at any one moment. But what I actually found was that coordination between teams was both necessary and yet somehow difficult. And often we would look back and think, well, why are things set up in this way? Why was this built like that? Who made that decision? And it was really unclear why certain decisions had been made. So there were lots of problems with that office-based environment. But the management of the company thought, well, we've got a great setup for remote working. We've got all the technologies. They use Jira rather than Trello. People obviously have strong opinions about that, but obviously you can plan things quite well with Jira. That's what it does. We used Slack. We didn't use Google Docs, but we used Office 365. Skype for Business, as I mentioned. You can do video calls with it if it cooperates with you enough. And GitHub again. So all the tools and technologies were actually very similar to what I had been used to using at Stack Overflow. And yet something wasn't quite right, because every time I decided to work from home for a day, I sort of felt like I could only sort of do half of my job, really. I would always feel a bit kind of left out, that I wasn't really able to engage fully with work as I could when I was in the office. So I've talked a lot about remote work, but first, I think maybe let's take a step back, and I should probably explain why I think remote work is actually a good thing in the first place. So there's a number of reasons why I think remote work is really good. One of the main things that I got out of working from home was peaceful, quiet working conditions. That's been one of the big surprises going back into an office, is just how loud it is. There's lots of people in offices talking away all the time, and people who have some really annoying habits as well, kind of picking their teeth and just kind of making weird grunting noises every few minutes. There's always somebody who's got a mechanical keyboard just rattling away like a machine gun. It's a very distracting environment to be in, and I found that I was a lot more productive when I could have some peace and quiet and focus on my work. The other advantage of remote work is the lack of a commute. I timed this just the other day. The walk from my bedroom to the office that I have at the back of my house is about 5 seconds. Compared that to the commute that I do every day now, pretty much, from my house in London to where my office is, also in London, it takes me an hour each way, even though I'm just traveling in the same city. And that's on a good day when the transport is actually working properly. Work-life balance is another thing that remote work can really benefit. If you have to look after children, for example, then being at home can really help you to do that. And it means generally you're a lot more able to set your own schedule. If I fancied a nap in the middle of the day, then that's a lot easier when there's a bed 5 seconds away from my office than it is when I go into town. Less sickness was something that I noticed as well, not just because I wasn't picking up so many bugs from being on public transport and being around people so much, but also even on times when I did get a bit unwell, I was much more able to face my 5-second commute and do a bit of work, which is often quite a nice thing to do actually, to sort of take your mind off, feeling a bit ill. So I took fewer sick days. And generally, I think there's a lot less stress involved when you're working remotely. And that then leads to a virtuous cycle, because less stress means that you're even more productive, and less stress also means that you get less sick. There are further benefits, not just personal ones, to allowing remote work in your company. Hiring and retention is quite a big one. Being able to be anywhere in the world to do work means that you can keep staff around longer. When I worked at Stack Overflow, there were a couple of developers who had been working full-time in the New York office. They moved out of New York because they had families and wanted to bring them up in the suburbs. But they didn't have to leave their jobs in order to do so. There were also another couple of people I knew who were able to do things like travel the world while not having to take 6 months off work. They were able to carry on working while they did that. It means you can hire from anywhere in the world. Why restrict your hiring pool just to people who live within a certain radius of your office? You get a much bigger candidate pool when you've got the entire world out there. And it makes your company more attractive to work for, because I think generally people do want to be able to work remote these days. So that means that you can hire from even more candidates. And I think there's another point which I don't hear talked about so much regarding remote work, and that's actually around the diversity and inclusion aspect of things. If you actually take a step back and think for a moment, who is the office environment actually optimized for? Who finds that the most effective? It's people who have no commitments and can easily spend all day away from home. It's people who have the energy to face the commute every day. It's people who like being surrounded by people, and it's people who live nearby. Is it any wonder that so often when you have a team shot showing our developers on our website, it looks a bit like this. It's just full of young, extroverted males. And I think we can do a lot better than that. We can also try to cater for people who have commitments to care for children or older parents. And we know that that is disproportionately women in the current society that we're living in. People who have physical impairments, for example, and people who are just not energized by being around noisy people all the time. Or just people who live somewhere else. I mean, come on. So in summary, remote work can be good for people with all kinds of differences in gender, age, physical abilities, ethnicity, different ways of seeing the world. These are the kinds of things that we want more of in our companies. I don't think remote work is going to suddenly solve the problem of diversity in technology, but I think it can go a really good way to helping out. So in summary then, why remote work is good: more productive, happier, healthier, more talented, more diverse employees, stronger teams, leads to better outcomes, and it saves money. I mean, the evidence is pretty overwhelming, isn't it, that that is a good thing for the companies and the businesses that we work in. If you imagine for a moment if remote work was the way that we had always done it. We're here in Bizarro world at Bizarro Codemotion, where all of us day-to-day work from home all of the time, and I'm here to give you a rousing talk to tell you why the future of work is everybody going to a noisy place at the exact same time. It's completely ridiculous, isn't it? So, given all of that, why is it that we don't work remotely all of the time? Is it that employers simply don't trust people to get their work done? I used to believe that that must be the only reason why remote work wasn't more prevalent. But I don't think it is that, because the companies that I've worked in since being remote full-time, trust wasn't really the main problem there. The main problem seems to be that some people believe it is less effective. I did that little survey at the start of this talk, and I think it's fair to say a majority of people in this room, at the start of the talk anyway, believe that remote work was not as effective as being in the office. And I can understand that because a lot of people believe working remotely is actually about emulating being in the office. If you look at that list of technologies again, Trello, Slack, internal chat, and things like that, you can kind of imagine that those are just emulating physical things. Trello, we're just emulating what we would do with physical Post-it notes. Google Hangouts, we're just emulating what it would be like if we were really face-to-face. And so if you think about these technologies and think, well, what would the ultimate remote work technology look like, then logically you might come to a conclusion that this is the kind of thing that we should be aiming for remote work. And I don't think I really need to kind of point out all the ways in which this is an utterly ridiculous contraption that isn't really going to help remote workers at all. I don't know if you've ever used one. I have briefly, and it's a bit of a weird kind of out-of-body experience because you're moving this thing around and it feels like a computer game, and you sort of feel like, well, I could just crash this into these people in the office here. But if you do that, then next time you come into the office, you're not really going to be a very popular person. So no, I don't think that the future of remote work is tools that enable us to be like Daleks running around the office and bashing into people. I think what we actually need to do is change our mindset a bit and actually flip the question on its head. What happens if we make office work like remote work? And that is fundamentally what the idea of remote first means. So as an analogy for remote first, I guess a lot of us here are probably familiar with developing for the web. I like to think of mobile-first design, which was something that we started doing in web development, I guess, in the last kind of 10 years or so. And the reason that mobile-first design came about was to solve the problem whereby smartphones had just come out, but most of the web was designed for desktop use, and it didn't really work too well. Smartphones did a variety of things around, like making some of the text bigger on desktop sites, but it was generally quite a clunky experience browsing desktop websites on a mobile phone. And so as an industry, we shifted, and pretty much, I think, most processes now for designing a website do it in this kind of responsive, mobile-first way. And it means, you design your website for mobile devices, and then it seamlessly scales up to tablets and full-size desktop devices. It's the same website, it just displays differently on the different device. And I think there's an analogy to be drawn here with remote-first work. With remote-first work, you set up your processes so that they work well for people who are always at home. And what you find is seamlessly they carry on working for people who are sometimes at home and sometimes in the office, all the way through to people who prefer to stay in the office all the time. So what does remote-first work actually consist of? What do you have to do to enable remote-first? I think the main rule of remote-first work is to favor asynchronous communication. So let's just look at what that actually means. So synchronous communication is kind of what's happening now, really. It's people participating at the same time. I'm talking, you're listening, we're doing it at the same time. You're waiting for me to speak, I'm speaking to you. At the end, maybe there'll be some questions and we'll be swapping messages kind of back and forth. So examples of that are meetings, video calls, and so on. Asynchronous work is where people participate at different times, and they're not necessarily actively waiting for incoming messages and replies. They may go off and do something else in the meantime and get back to you an hour later, a day later. So you've got tools like email and Google Docs to help you with asynchronous work. There is another tool which I kind of struggle with actually to kind of place into one bucket or the other, and I think other people do as well, and that is Slack. And I think some of the difficulties that we have with Slack come from a mismatch of expectations. Sometimes people use Slack in a very synchronous way, and sometimes people want to use it in a very asynchronous way. I've got a few tips later on about Slack usage, which will kind of hopefully go some way to resolving this, or at least make you think about it a bit more. So how do you favor asynchronous communication? Well, the first step is to avoid meetings wherever possible. Instead, prefer writing documents, sending emails, and using Slack. Write things down. And remember, the point of asynchronous communication is you're allowing people to respond in their own time. So that means don't expect responses to the things that you're saying straight away. Collaborative documents for everything. This was the lifeblood of how Stack Overflow operated on a day-to-day basis. On any given day, I may have 3 or 4 or more Google Docs to take a look at and write comments on, make adjustments and so forth. I've written here a few examples of the kinds of things that we would use collaborative docs for. Things like requests for comments. If somebody had an idea for a new feature, a new system they wanted to build, write it up, describing the problem and what is being proposed, send it out, see what people think of it. For more kind of HR stuff, things like updating an engineering careers ladder, that's another kind of thing that you can send out via Google Docs and get people's feedback. When there was an outage, a post-mortem would be written up, showing the timeline of what had happened, who had done what, lessons learned, suggestions for the future. That can all be done through collaborative documents as well. Monthly planning, who's going to do what this month, what features we're going to punt to next month. That can all be done Google Docs, Google Spreadsheets. Weekly status updates, rather than having a meeting saying, oh, what did you do yesterday or last week? What did you do yesterday or last week? You can write those things up into a document. People can ask questions on that document about the thing that you did last week. They can ask you things like, oh, can you point me to some more information about that thing you're working on? Because that sounds relevant to the thing that I'm working on. So conversations can happen asynchronously through these documents. And more technical things like plans for migrating to some new version of some framework. All of these things can be done through collaborative documents. And yet in a lot of companies, I see these kinds of things done through synchronous conversations. Now you may think, okay, fine, writing up documents, great, but I prefer just to grab people, get them into a room, we'll thrash this out and it will be a lot quicker. You might think, well, isn't it a lot of work to write these documents all the time? Well, if you think about it, if you take 5 people into a meeting for an hour, then you've taken up 5 person hours of your company's time. Versus if you, organizing the meeting, actually take twice as long to write up an initial document, that's 2 person hours, and then you circulate it to the other 4, who each take 15 minutes to review it, add their suggestions, and so on. That's another 1 person hour there, which is a grand total of 3 person hours. So you've actually saved time by doing that, just not your own time. So it's about being respectful of other people's time. The other benefits of working in this way are that the people you send that document to have as much time as they need to think through the details and the ramifications of what it is that you're proposing. They can go off, they can do their own research, they can ask you as many questions as they want about it. I don't know if you've had this experience where you've been in a meeting and you've been talking about some feature or something like that, and then maybe the following morning in the shower or something you think, oh yeah, isn't that going to cause a problem there? Well, when you're working in an asynchronous fashion, it doesn't matter when you have your questions and your ideas and your comments, you can always go back to the document and add them. It means you can involve other people. If you realize that you've been thrashing out this feature and, oh, we should really tell that team over there, well, you can just forward that document onto them. And it's free documentation because the document that you create is going to stay somewhere forever. So when you need to refer back to it, it's already there. You will understand exactly the context in which you made certain decisions. And so you won't be left wondering, well, why did we build that way? What was going on at the time? So asynchronous is all very well, but you do need to remember to move to sync when you need to. A good example might be if there's an outage happening right now, because you probably don't want to be just, oh yeah, I'll write it up. So the system seems to be down and we're not making any money. I'll circulate it and see what people think about that. So you need to move to sync in that situation. Also for more sensitive, delicate, interpersonal issues, it can be really beneficial to be face-to-face because you can see other people's reaction and you have that emotional connection there. There's no reason you can't do that through Google Hangouts or something like that, but having a synchronous conversation where you can see the other person is still valuable. And speaking of building relationships, setting aside regular time for one-to-ones is still very important, and you should do that face-to-face and synchronously as well on a regular basis. A few tips for when you do run synchronous meetings. I can hear music from somewhere. Synchronous meetings. One rule that we had at Stack Overflow was that if one person is remote, then everyone is remote. Now, I think this is a good rule to abide by. It's obviously quite difficult for those of us who work in open plan offices, but the general idea is that if I want to have a meeting with two other people and they're both in the same office as me, then if I was still working at Stack Overflow, we would each go to our own kind of private offices or a private space, and we would jump on Google Hangouts for that, because there might be other people who are remote who want to join in. And we've probably all had that experience where we've been dialed into a meeting, we're remote, we're on speakerphone in the middle of a desk, and we're surrounded, virtually by all of these other people who are actually physically in the office, and we get forgotten about, we can't always hear people. So the idea is to level the playing field, and everybody is dialing in the same way, even if they are physically quite close to each other. Make sure you write up notes during the meeting, because you're then going to circulate those afterwards so that the people who weren't around when you had the meeting can actually see what was going on. Access to information is another key thing. By default, I think all information should be accessible internally, unless there's a good reason for it not to be available to everybody. Again, back at Stack, we called this default public, and that was the rule that we tried to abide by. So that means you avoid private documents, you avoid private Slack channels. People seem to be big fans of setting up private Slack channels for things, but if everybody has access to the conversations that are going on, then it will be much easier for people to contribute to those conversations and refer back to them wherever they happen to be working. I talked a minute ago about jumping into synchronous communication when required. So what that means is if you did decide, we need to have a hangout to discuss, say, this outage, that you post a link to that hangout in your team's Slack channel so that other people can join in as they get to it. It means that everybody who wants to can participate in what's going on now, and everybody in the future can find the information that they need, because you're not locking information away anywhere. It all is hard work, but it's worth it. Things that are worth it generally are hard work, and I'm not here to tell you that remote work is easy, but I'm here to tell you here's how you can do it if you work hard at it. The thing that's interesting about remote first is that it really forces you to think. One big lesson that I've realized from coming back to working in an office most of the time is that actually, yes, office work mitigates a hell of a lot of problems. You can get away with so much stuff being really screwed up in your processes for communication and planning when you know you can just interrupt people at a moment's notice and grab a meeting room. So yes, office work is great for kind of covering over these vast cracks in the processes for how we run things. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try harder to fix the cracks. Being remote first forces you to really fix the problems that you have and adopt better practices around planning and communication. And it means you stop relying on people overhearing things to find out what's going on. But having said all of that, there are still objections that I hear to remote working. So I've got a couple of genuine objections that I've heard over the last couple of years. One CTO I spoke to when I was asking him about working at his company, I said, do you do remote work? And he said, oh, no, we don't do remote work here because we have a very strong collaborative culture. And I thought, well, this doesn't really make any sense to me, because it wasn't like I wasn't collaborating all the time when I was working remotely. And I realized that what this is kind of symptomatic of is people having assumptions about what collaboration means. And to find out what kind of assumptions people have about what collaboration means, I thought, well, let's take a look at some pictures of collaboration, some cheesy stock photos. So this is what people think collaboration looks like. A load of people attaching some sticky Post-it notes to a glass wall. This is what people think collaboration looks like. I mean, it's hard to tell what's really going on in that picture, who's talking to who. But that's not what collaboration means. Collaboration just simply means the action of working with someone to produce something. And the other thing is that collaboration doesn't happen by magic just because you get people together in the same room. And to give you an example of that, a lot of us, I assume, have worked in open plan offices, and again, returning to cheesy stock photos, this is the kind of thing that we put up with in open plan offices. Even cheesy stock photo people put in headphones from time to time to drown out the incessant chatter of their colleagues collaborating in the background. We have all the technologies that we need to collaborate effectively. All of these technologies on the screen here that I keep referring back to can be used for really effective, good quality collaboration. It is simply not about being in the same room. The other genuine objection that I've heard was from a former colleague of mine who said, oh, yeah, remote work doesn't really work around here. We're very agile. We need to make quick decisions. And when he said that, I thought, well, what he really means is we constantly need to interrupt people. We haven't got a clue how to plan anything. Everything is on fire all the time. The thing about remote work is that it does not mean fewer interactions. It actually means being more deliberate and clear in those interactions. It means that things happen intentionally instead of accidentally. Things are planned properly instead of happening by coincidence. And people communicate proactively instead of relying on other people overhearing what they're up to. It means you have to form new habits in how you go about your day-to-day work. And it means you can't anymore just interrupt somebody in the middle of what they're doing. But that, I think, is a feature and not a bug. So a few tips on a successful remote work setup. Good headsets are very important. Good microphones, so that background noise is cut out and people on the other end can really hear clearly what you're saying. Private spaces are very useful to have in the office if you need to jump into a synchronous chat. This is if you're still working in the office and working with remote people. You'll still need to have private conversations from time to time, and so you will have, private spaces are very good for doing that because you don't want to be having those in an open plan office. Also, it can mitigate that issue that you may have had if there's been like multiple people dialed in an open plan office to the same meeting and one person starts speaking, then you can hear them both from the sort of through the physical air and through the headset, and there's always a lag there, and that's a very distracting thing to happen. So private spaces are good to get over that issue. And turn your video on, because remember, we still want to maintain these personal relationships with people, and people being able to see you is quite important for that. A few quick tips about Slack. It's synchronous-ish, and it's also asynchronous-ish. And I think problems happen when people start using Slack one way and then expect things to happen the other way. So yes, sometimes you can have synchronous conversations via Slack and people are chatting back and forth, but at any time your Slack conversation can suddenly become asynchronous. So you have to write things in such a way that your conversation will still make sense if somebody comes back to it, an hour later after they come out of a meeting or from picking up their child or whatever it is they're doing. It's ephemeral. I think a lot of people get annoyed by Slack because they see the big red number there that says they have 2,000 unread messages or whatever it is. But these things are supposed to it's not your email inbox, basically, is what I'm trying to say. You don't have to read all public messages. And that feeds into my next point, actually, because I think what a mindset of, I have to read everything leads to is this scenario that I've seen in a lot of companies where there's just an explosion of Slack channels, and it makes it really hard to actually find where people are talking about any given topic. I felt that when I was in an environment where there was just one channel per team, that actually worked a lot better. Yes, there were a lot of messages, but you always knew where people were, where the discussion was happening. Remember that it's not for everything. Move from Slack to email, docs, Hangouts when necessary. And don't expect an immediate response. My pet hate is when somebody on Slack just sends me a message saying, "Hi, what do you want?" Hiring for remote work, you need to hire people who are self-motivated and proactive and super communicative. Otherwise, it's not going to work so well. And companies need to hire and train for those skills. But don't they sound like the kind of skills that you want anyway, especially in developers? A bit about personal challenges now, though, because, remote work can be quite difficult on a personal level. One problem that you can face when working remotely is just a feeling of isolation, because you can be out just on your own, in your own office, not really connecting to people. So remember to leave the house, see your friends from time to time, go to meetups. When I worked at Stack Overflow, there was an office in London, and I would go into that about once a week just to get out of the house, because I noticed I got a bit cranky if I was at home just 5 days a week straight. Remember to shower and put on clothes. Another problem with remote work is a risk of feeling a bit disconnected from what's going on. Everybody in the office is kind of having a good time and you're kind of left out. So it's related to the previous point, but not quite the same. And I think everybody, whether you're working at home, and especially if you work in the office, you need to remember that some people are remote. And what that means is that you've got to be careful about communications, like if you send an all-staff email, assuming that it's just going to people in the office saying, hey, birthday cake on level 3, everybody, yeah. And that's going to really annoy people who are many, many hundreds of miles away from level 3 and are probably not going to make the special trip. There can be a lack of opportunities to build those human connections and friendship, and the solution to that is exploring social things via the technologies that you've got available to you. So having social Slack channels. One of the nice things that we did at Stack Overflow was what was called a remote bev bash, which was basically started by somebody who at the end of one Friday said, well, I'm just going to drink a beer in my office on a Google Hangout now, and anybody who wants to join me can. And that just grew into a whole thing, and people would just hang out with each other. Sometimes we would play computer games through that. There's party games that you can share the screen for, and that was really cool. Company meetups in person, very important also for building those personal relationships, because you do need to see people in the flesh from time to time, and an annual or a 6-monthly meetup can be a good opportunity to do that. Work-life balance is another thing that can be problematic when working remotely, and the solution to that is really about setting kind of clear boundaries. So actually, this is an interesting point. It kind of slightly goes against one of the advantages that I said earlier, because your work-life balance can be really improved through remote work, but you can find a problem where you're having trouble separating your work life from your home life. So you can do that through setting boundaries through time or space. I had a separate office, so it was always kind of clear, I'm in work mode now, I'm in my office. But if you're working from home in a smaller, one-bedroom flat, say, then you probably need to be a bit stricter about the times that you allow yourself to be working remotely. Procrastination opportunities is a problem, and I don't really have a very good solution for that other than just discipline. You just need to know how to do work when you're there to do work. And if you have problems with that, then maybe the office is better for you because you've got other people to keep you on the straight and narrow. And if you're energized by being around other people, then ultimately maybe remote work is not for you either. But that's fine. Remember that working in an office also has a lot of challenges. Life is hard. Remember we talked about these office challenges earlier, the noise, the distractions, the commute, the stress, and the sickness that comes with it. Ultimately, remote work is not actually for everyone. But I do believe that everybody can benefit if we adopt these remote-first working practices. It means you can work at home, you can work in the office, or mix it up, do a bit of both. Everybody can work together efficiently in a way that suits them. And what we'll end up with are happier, healthier, more productive, more diverse, more talented, stronger teams, and that will lead to better outcomes for the team and ultimately for the business, which ultimately then leads to something that every company cares about, which is money. Thanks very much.